Hello, welcome to Lecture 6 in the Stevenson School for Ministry course, Theological Reflection, Living and Thinking Through the Lens of Theology. And today, in week 6, we're going to look at how to do theological reflection in a time of devastation. Last week, you'll remember that we looked at the Hebrew prophet Ezekiel, looked at his way of doing theological reflection. And you'll remember that his experience was one of crushing humiliation. His people had been defeated by the Babylonian Empire and taken largely into exile in the Babylonian cities, where the people of God, whose whole covenant and whole identity was based in the possession of land. You remember that was a part of the covenant promise that God gave to Moses. That whole covenant now seems fractured, and along with just the humiliation and the hardship of being taken into exile is this massive theological difficulty and the problem of who we are if we don't have the land that God has promised us. You'll remember too that his reflection piece consisted of remembering that covenant. The fact that the covenant was now broken, that it was shattered, was a means of reflection for Ezekiel, and where he begins to speak his words of authority to the people. So he interprets the predicament of their exile in the light of his theological reflection on the covenant. The people have broken the covenant, and so that's why they are now suffering the loss of their land. He does, you'll know as well, feel their pain. He's not just speaking as somebody who's standing outside of the people, but he's speaking very much as one of them. But it's not the end of the story, because he points to some hope for restoration in the future. So you remember that we looked at what this means for us, how we can now use Ezekiel's model as we do theological reflection in our parishes. So if his ministry was fueled by his experience of exile, of despair, humiliation and powerlessness, then for us it means that we too have a role to play in a world and in a climate of exile. So who do we see living in exile? Well, firstly, us, the church. This is not our home. We are just passing through here. We are sojourners. We are strangers in a strange land. So we minister to ourselves because we live in a world where we do not belong, essentially. But also, quite literally, we speak to exiles as well, and we speak on behalf of refugees and indeed all immigrants. Jesus himself was a refugee in Egypt. And refugees are very much on his heart. And we speak as well hope and peace to people who are lost in any way, people who are living in exile in their own homes or their own cities, because for some reason they are just not at home in themselves or in their environments. So that was Ezekiel, and we're now today going to look at another of the Hebrew prophets, and we'll meet him in just a moment. But before that, I want to introduce you to a theologian who I think has some important things to say on the subject of theological reflection. She's Judith Thompson, and she is actually a British theologian, and she provides an interesting model. It's similar to the ones we've seen before, but her model of theological reflection has 5 parts in it. You remember we're using one that has 4 parts because we're not repeating a step of reflection. But Thompson says this is how she does it. She focuses on some event. She fills out that event with the memories of the sights, the sounds, the people. So instantly you'll notice that imagination for Judith Thompson is a central element of theological reflection. And I really like this because imagination, for theologians is perhaps not something that we are particularly noted for. And here's Thompson saying that, the imagination can be used as a way of discerning the voice and work of God in our environments. So then the reflection piece, the finding connections between the event and the religious texts, parables, prayers, metaphors, images, symbols, events of the faith. So we draw on all that biblical material and all the material we have from our liturgy, from our personal experience of God, our prayer life, our times of fellowship and sharing in groups and churches, things that we've received as being authentically from God. We draw in all those things and reread the event. And that's at step 4. So we've got all that material that we draw on, all that personal material and biblical and liturgical material, and then we reinterpret the event, and that causes us to do something. So Thompson suggests taking 2 or 3 actions as a result of your reflection, and make a commitment to do one of them. So, in other words, theological reflection for her is a connection between belief and practice. Clearly, we know it, that belief without practice is not authentic. James says faith without deeds is dead. It just doesn't exist. It can't exist. If somebody says they have faith but it isn't demonstrated in their life, then their faith is non-existent. It's something else, but it's not faith. Now, theological reflection as a discipline is still fairly new. It has its origins in liberation theology, and clearly so because many Christians in Latin America in the 1970s in particular onwards, living as faithful Christians, often in poverty, often in oppression with dictatorial governments, often military juntas, not democratically elected, and living under severe conditions. And in that experience, they reread their scriptures and applied those scriptures, found the connection between the scriptures and the experiences that they were having, and developed their own theological hermeneutic. And it was done in community as well, the base communities in Latin America. So a necessary part then of the origins of theological reflection are that it is done in community. Now, Thompson then goes on to talk about the importance of experience. Often theologians, we have this reputation of being very thoughtful to the point of being, completely otherworldly. We're just stuck in our heads and we're just having nice, theological thoughts. We're having ideas about God and Jesus, but if that actually makes it into the marketplace, out into the world, then that's a rare thing. That's at least the image that theologians can have. But for Judith Thompson, she sees that all theology comes from experience originally. So in the New Testament, the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus and his words and his actions are the key events, that they're the key things that form our theology. So it is the experience of this man and of people who came into contact with this man and recorded accounts of his words and his actions. That's the heart of our theology. It's not done in our heads. It is done originally from an encounter with a certain human being living in a particular time and place. It continues with Paul, who, although he has the reputation of being very dry and dusty and very theoretical in his theology, and some would say he actually created Christianity. Nonetheless, his theology is born out of his experience as a missionary and an evangelist, a church planter, someone who is traveling around preaching the gospel, leading people to Christ, establishing churches, and then encountering troubling circumstances and events in those congregations. So his theology is not done, in a vacuum. It's done in community with real Christians who are experiencing all manner of difficult experiences, persecution and heresy and oppression of all kinds. So that's where the theology comes from for Paul. And it happened as well in the early church fathers as they developed the theology which we now take for granted. Again, it was done very much with experience first and then the thinking. So the raw material is what they were actually experiencing. St. Augustine, for example, he's famous for developing the theology of original sin. It's not a theology that I particularly am a fan of, and I suspect that most of us would find that particular doctrine to be slightly distasteful. But it was a theology that was born out of his experience of infant baptism. So it wasn't done, theology first, then see how it applies to life. It was experiencing the liturgy of infant baptism. And then from that developed the idea that children need to go through this ritual in order to cleanse them from original sin. And many of our other doctrines, some of the more crucial doctrines like the Trinity and the incarnation of Jesus, these were developed out of liturgy, out of the experience of worship, rather than the other way round. And it was only really in the Middle Ages that our theology became separated from practice and actually became the foundation of practice rather than the other way round. So it became this systematic discipline, and that's when the great universities in Europe were established, and theology was the thing in all of those universities. So theological reflection is all about the integration of belief and practice, of doctrine and action. It's where those two things meet. Doctrines, of course, become what can be called as guru's cats. That parable about somebody who had a fairly unruly cat, and so every morning when they were at prayer, the cat would be disturbing them, so they'd tie the cat to the bedpost. And then over time, this has become an established tradition that this person would tie the cat to the bedpost at the start of their time of prayer. And so that tradition became passed on to other people. And so people with no idea of why they should tie a cat to the bedpost when they pray went through that custom. And you have this this rather absurd practice of tying a cat to a bedpost when you pray, but no one understands why they do that. So that's a funny little parable to just kind of exemplify what happens with our doctrines. They can become quite cut off from practice, from action. And theological reflection prevents us from doing that. It always forces us, once we've reflected on our experience and on our scriptures and liturgy, to then go out into some sort of affirmative action. So Judith Thompson then, this is a fairly lengthy quote, but I think it says pretty much what she wants to say on this matter. Theological reflection is a precise, disciplined activity undertaken methodically and rigorously by ministers, lay people, or practitioners of any faith who seek to consciously and deliberately integrate belief and practice. It relates insights and resources from a theological tradition specifically and carefully to contemporary situations and vice versa, so that mutually enlightening reappraisal may result. Pointers are sought to action which leads to a response which is more authentically true to the tradition on which it is based. Hope you can see the point she's making there. Now, something she goes on to say is there are two types of theological reflection. There is what she would say kairos theological reflection and chronos theological reflection. And kairos and chronos are Greek words, and they both mean time. And both of them are used in the New Testament Greek. And they're different, though. Even though we only have one English word for these two Greek words, the two Greek words mean something quite different. Kairos is a moment in time, it's that sort of time, and chronos is like a whole expanse of time. So we have just one word, and Greek has those two words. So theological reflection has both of them, according to Judith Thompson. So there are sudden moments of inspiration which are caused by a crisis. Something terrible happens, and you are forced to look at your religious tradition, your scriptures, your liturgy, your prayer, and see how what you have in your spiritual tradition, how that is now impacted by this awful event that has just happened, how the two things relate to each other. So there's that kind of theological reflection, and there is the chronos kind, which is not in response to a crisis. It's something that you do every day. So rather like prayer, if you only do it when there's an emergency, that really is a substandard prayer life. The point is that you do it regularly. You have a daily time of prayer set aside, and as the day goes on, you hopefully will want to be sort of just checking in with God from time to time to keep that prayerful relationship healthy. So theological reflection then should be like that as well, as part of your normal spiritual disciplines. And she says that old mnemonic for prayer, ACTS, works for theological reflection. So there's an adoration aspect, a readiness to respond to experiences that God has given you, and an attitude of love in response to those experiences. There is confession. The whole point of theological reflection is that we change, is that we turn around, we possibly repent, or we possibly grow in some grace or some gift from God. There is also thanksgiving, because what we're doing when we do theological reflection is spotting God, where God is active in our lives and in our world, and so that has to be a thing that we do with gratitude. And we also do it with supplication. In other words, what we then go on and do is we live in this open-hearted way of requesting God in our lives. That's the action. So on to this week's Hebrew prophet, and it is Jeremiah. So there he is, looking suitably glum, because as we'll see from Jeremiah, he's not a particularly jolly chap, really. He's sometimes called the prophet of doom, and there's a good reason for that. So let's start as ever with who he was. And he was actually a priest. So just as Isaiah was, that we looked at 2 or 3 weeks ago, so Jeremiah was a priest, and he was from the city of priests. This was a city called Anathoth, which is about 15 kilometers or so from Jerusalem. So from that you'll know it's in the southern kingdom, it's in Judah. And the very first verse of the prophecy of Jeremiah is this: the words of Jeremiah, son of Hilkiah, one of the priests of Anathoth in the territory of Benjamin. So he's a religious professional, and he began his ministry, we can pinpoint this very accurately, in the year 627 BC. He tells us that in verse 2 of chapter 1, where he says, the word of the Lord came to him in the 13th year of the reign of King Josiah, son of Ammon, king of Judah. So we know, historians say, okay, the 13th year of Josiah's reign, that was the year 627. So you'll notice from that, this is 100 years after the fall of the northern kingdom to the Assyrians, but it's not yet time for the fall of Jerusalem to the Babylonians. There's this in-between time where Judah has an alliance with Egypt before Babylon really gets on the scene and begins its period of imperial dominance. And one of the remarkable things about Jeremiah is his sense of call. He has this really passionate belief that he has met with God and been given this extraordinary task to speak God's word to his people. And this famous verse, which you probably know, 1 verse 5, before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. Before you were born, I set you apart. I appointed you as a prophet to the nations. So that's the word of God to Jeremiah. And so Jeremiah has this firm belief that before he was even born, God had called him and given him a task, created him for a reason, which was to speak to the people of Israel. So now we're going to go into a little more depth about the conquest of Jerusalem. And we looked at this briefly last week, but a bit more depth for you today. There was this great king called Josiah. He's great because the writers of Second Kings and Second Chronicles say he was, and the reason they say he was is because he was religiously very committed to the faith of the faith of his ancestors. So he was a devout man. And was set about, during his long and fruitful reign, set about re-establishing the worship of Yahweh as the only legitimate worship. So he instituted a whole range of reforms, which included removing pagan cults and shrines, destroying those shrines, and even putting to death the priests of those false religions. And all worship of even the one God outside Jerusalem was closed down as well. Now, along with those reforms came a resurgent nationalism, and that's important for what we're going to learn about Jeremiah in a few moments' time. So, Josiah, who was actually only 16 when he came to the throne, reigns for a very long time and institutes these radical reforms to get the nation back to true worship of God. One of the unfortunate side effects of this was that the centralization of the faith in Jerusalem. Remember, I said that all sites outside Jerusalem were closed down. This led to people in Jerusalem having a kind of a sham, fake religion, trying to impress, the hierarchy in the capital city of their religiosity. This is a sad consequence of all kind of establishment of religion. In England, where of course the church is still established, the church has lost so much of its edge and its passion and its relevance because it is so closely associated with the established and the ruling class of the country. And that's how it was under the reign of Josiah. Now, Josiah dies in the year 609, and Jehoahaz becomes the king. And he was a weak leader and not particularly committed to God, and so the people go back to their old ways before Josiah's reforms. The result of that was public immorality, the persecution of God's prophets, and these other prophets, these false prophets, who said that everything is fine. The country is doing really well. God is pleased with us. God's blessing us, and everything is well. All except one prophet, at least only one that we read about in this book, and that's Jeremiah. And his view, his prophecy is exactly the opposite of these false prophets. So Jeremiah stands up to the religious orthodoxy and says, no, there is a spiritual drift occurring in the country, and God is becoming displeased with us. Now, in the year 599, Jehoahaz's successor Jehoiakim rebels against the Babylonian emperor, who is Nebuchadnezzar, and Nebuchadnezzar punishes Judah. Jehoiakim actually dies, and his son Jehoiachin takes over, and he is taken captive after just 3 months of his reign. And so Zedekiah, another king, is placed on the throne by Nebuchadnezzar, placed there as something of a weak puppet so he can easily manipulate him. And but Zedekiah doesn't actually play by the rules, and he has a sort of a mini rebellion which results in Jerusalem falling in 597, with the great and the good being deported to to Babylon, and we saw last week that Ezekiel was in that first wave of exiles to be deported. Now, Jehoiachin, when he was only 18, he actually consults Jeremiah. We read this in chapter 37 to 38 of Jeremiah, which is really interesting. So here's the king, a very young man, consults Jeremiah. Jeremiah basically says, give in. You know, God is punishing the nation, so don't resist the Babylonians. But Jehoiachin, although he is drawn to this advice, is too weak to actually do anything about it. The false prophets, once the exile begins, say it's only going to last 2 years. That's in chapter 28. But Jeremiah prophesies it's going to last 70. And guess which is true? So the whole point of Jeremiah's prophecy, one of the big points at least, is surrender. We have to accept that this is God's will. The Babylonians are God's tool to bring about our punishment, and we need to just surrender to the Babylonian forces. And Zedekiah wishes to do that, but he's too scared to actually follow through. In 587, Zedekiah is captured and the city is burnt down and is destroyed. And many more leaders are taken into Babylon, the second wave of exiles. So that by 587, it's generally only the poor peasants who remained and Jeremiah. And a third deportation happens in the year 582, which you can read about in chapter 42 of Jeremiah's book. So in a nutshell then, the Babylonians have sacked Jerusalem, as we read last week. Ezekiel is taken off and he sits down by the waters of Babylon in utter despair and exile. Jeremiah, though, remains in the city and experiences the horror of a city that is under siege, with all the terrible, starvation and disease and appalling conditions that always ensue when a city is under siege. So the conquest of Jerusalem is the disorientation that he's experiencing, the desolation and carnage. The book of Lamentation, which comes immediately after Jeremiah in the Old Testament, some think that Jeremiah wrote it. I don't know whether that's accurate or not. But whether he did or he didn't, it's a horrifying account of the city as it suffers under siege. So have a read of Lamentation if you have a strong stomach. And of course, here's God's people saying, how did this happen? How did God let his people suffer in this way? So that's a big theological question, and Jeremiah answers the question. So his message was, Israel have sinned, and it's two kinds. There's false religion, and there are social and ethical ills, some of which are similar, I guess, to those that Amos spoke about in the northern kingdom over 100 years earlier. And Jeremiah takes aim at the nation's pillars of faith, the temple. Let me read to you some of these extraordinary oracles that Jeremiah prophesies. So here's chapter 7, verses 3 to 8. This is what the Lord Almighty, the God of Israel, says. Reform your ways and your actions, and I will let you live in this place. Do not trust in deceptive words and say, "This is the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord." If you really change your ways and your actions and deal with each other justly, if you do not oppress the alien, the fatherless, or the widow, and do not shed innocent blood in this place, and if you do not follow other gods to your own harm, then I will let you live in this place, in the land. I will give the land I gave your forefathers for ever and ever. But look, you are trusting in deceptive words that are worthless. So there they are going, we got the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord, and it's all worthless, according to Jeremiah. Now, the covenant. We'll see in the next few minutes that this is a massive theme for Jeremiah. Really, his whole book is really about the covenant and the breaking of it. They have insider privilege status. They've been chosen by God, they've been blessed, and yet they have still rebelled and rejected the covenant. And even the great King David, his dynasty is shattered. So their faith in all of these things is now shredded, and Jeremiah expresses God's anger at all these things. Um, to us, in our day and age, we would say that anybody who says when their city is being invaded, we should just surrender, we should go over to the other side, God is on their side, not on our side, we would accuse them of being a traitor. We would say that this is sedition. And so and that is exactly what Jeremiah was accused of. So his message is actually one of sedition. And he says it in several ways. He puts on an ox yoke and walks around with it as a sign to the people that they must wear the yoke of Nebuchadnezzar. He says this boldly to King Zedekiah and to the temple crowd. Let me, no, I won't read that. He actually writes to the exiles in Babylon, to Ezekiel's people, and tells them, look, we've got people here who are prophesying the end of the exile in a couple of years. Don't listen to them. You're going to be there for a really long time. He's accused of being in league with the Babylonian army, and to an extent, I guess he probably was. Nebuchadnezzar was God's instrument to bring judgment on the people, and therefore to resist Nebuchadnezzar was to resist God. So the nation was founded, in Jeremiah's view, on their faith in Yahweh. So to actually urge surrender, that is a really it's a really serious thing to do. I don't know whether it's possible to actually imagine somebody today in a nation that's at war doing that and actually being allowed to do it without serious punishment. So God is fighting with the Babylonians. Now, there was actually a brief cessation of violence, and people started to think, okay, so God is now finished punishing us. But Jeremiah said, no, don't rest. This is going to happen again. This is just a short period. And he actually advises his people to desert. So he says, chapter 21. This is what the Lord says. See, I am setting before you the way of life and the way of death. Whoever stays in this city will die by the sword, famine, or plague. But whoever goes out and surrenders to the Babylonians who are besieging you will live. He will escape with his life. I have determined to do this city harm and not good, declares the Lord. It will be given into the hands of the king of Babylon, and he will destroy it with fire. So the word of the Lord is, leave the city with your hands up. And just to show how much he's willing to suffer for his art, Jeremiah stays in the city after its destruction to continue to preach. And yet, throughout the book, there is a strong suggestion that God still loves the people of Israel. He chose them. They were his first fruits, his choice wine, his beloved. They are his heritage, his vineyard, his flock. He loves them with an everlasting love. He considers them as his wife, as his son. And there is this element of hope, which is extraordinary given the seriousness of the message of Jeremiah in the rest of the book. So there is this wonderful prophecy which we actually read on one of the Sundays in our 3-year lectionary. I forget which one it is, but this is what God says. The time is coming, declares the Lord, when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah. It will not be like the covenant I made with their forefathers when I took them by the hand to lead them out of Egypt, because they broke my covenant, though I was a husband to them, declares the Lord. This is the covenant I will make with the house of Israel after that time. I will put my law in their minds and write it on their hearts. I will be their God, and they will be my people. I will surely gather them from all the lands where I banished them in my furious anger and great wrath. I will bring them back to this place and let them live in safety. They will be my people and I will be their God. I will give them singleness of heart and action so that they will always fear me for their own good and for the good of their children. As I have brought all this calamity on this people, so I will give them all the prosperity I have promised them. Once more fields will be bought in this land, of which you will say it was a desolate waste without men or animals, for it has been handed over to the Babylonians. Fields will be bought for silver, and deeds will be signed, sealed, and witnessed. And so this is wonderful stuff that Jeremiah gives, as well as the judgment. So what is the reflection? What are the stories that he uses in his reflection? Bear in mind, he still has no Old Testament to speak of. So he goes back to his calling, his awareness of the holiness of God, just as other prophets do. He goes through this amazing this call where God speaks to him, gives him a greeting. Jeremiah says, no, I can't do this. I'm not very good at speaking. You can't possibly call me to speak to the people. But nonetheless, God persists and says, you're going to go and you're going to be my tool. And this is going to be a sign that you are coming from me. So as I've thought about this, I've thought, what are the things that the aspects of God that Jeremiah is particularly keen on? And I think God's jealousy is one. These are his people, and God is being passionate. His anger is passionate. His jealousy is provoked because God is relational. There is this covenant relationship, not a bargain, not a deal, not legal, but this free covenantal relationship. And of course, the holiness of his call. What are the images and scriptures which he's particularly focused on and which inform his theological reflection? Well, it's simply this. It's the covenant. He mentions covenant 23 times. So let's look at his theological reflection. His experience is the sin of the people, the devastation of the besieged city, and the futile resistance to the Babylonians by the nation's leaders and by their religious prophets. His reflection is based on the holiness and reassurance that he gets from his call as God revealed himself in that event. He remembers the stories of God, especially the covenant, and he remembers the reforms of Josiah. And his response to all of this, the joining of the experience and the stories that he has, is this: surrender, repent, and there will be hope for restoration. So what does this mean then for us following Jeremiah's theological reflection in a time of devastation? So if Jeremiah's ministry was fueled by this national devastation in the face of people's sin, then what does this mean for us? And I think one of the key questions then is, how far are we prepared to name the sins of our people being both the church and the nation? I've been just thinking about this whole sedition thing, this message that God is on their side, not our side. We must surrender. And just thinking of how radical that message is and how unwelcome it would be in any sort of modern nation state for the church to stand up and say, God is not on our side. God is on the side of our adversaries. That really is a radical thing. I wonder if you could just imagine doing that in our environment today. So being a Jeremiah, I think, doing the theological reflection of Jeremiah means that we recognize this: all nations are fleeting. All empires are here one day and gone the next. That's how it's been since the beginning of time, and it's how it will continue. So at this moment, if you are a citizen of the United States, then your nation is the most powerful one in the world. But there will be a day when it is not. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. That's the way it is in our world. Kingdoms rise, kingdoms fall, and there are often reasons for why they fall. So it forces us to have a sense of humility about our nation, whether you're American or any other nation that you belong to. It tells us that modern nation states are not God's people, and that it really is not very sensible to read the Old Testament and to read what God says to the people of Israel and read the United States into that, because the United States isn't there. We are not on the same relational level as God's Old Testament people were. God's New Testament people are the church. It's not the United States, it's the church. There is this element that can arise, I think, in our churches of the flag and the cross. You hold one in one hand and one in the other, and you actually can wrap the cross in the flag and pretend or make a case for whatever our government happens to say, then that is God's will. If our government declares war on a particular nation, then clearly that is what God wants. God is on our side. We mustn't speak out against a particular war that we're involved in because God is with the flag, and that is a danger. And you have, I think, in our lifetime, in recent years, we've heard that from many churches and from many leading public Christians, and to go along with that is extremely dangerous, I think. And it also says that conscientious objectors, people who have refused to fight for their faith, it kind of says that they were a bit kind of foolish, that they were not correct to think that God wanted them to withdraw. The more pacifist of the denominations like Anabaptists and Quakers, they have a wonderful gift for us to help us, I think, separate the flag and the cross when we get too close to identifying them as the same thing. So God is not necessarily on our side. Nationalism is a sin, I believe. And I think I think nationalism is distinct from patriotism. Patriotism is being pleased that you happen to be a citizen of a particular country, and I think every citizen of every country in the world can have a very right and healthy sense of patriotism. You can be glad that you belong to this country, in the way you can be glad that you belong to the fan club of a particular sports team. You know, there's nothing wrong with that level of patriotism. But by nationalism, what I mean is believing in your superiority, or the superiority of your nation, believing in your nation being better than other nations. Now that, I think, is a form of idolatry. And it's also profoundly untrue, because how do you measure the greatness of a country? You know, how do you do it? Is that done on dollar signs, you know, gross national product? Is that done on how much we give to the suffering in the world? Is it done according to the size of our military arsenal? Is it done according to how devoted we are to God? You know, how actually do you do it? You know, is it about life expectancy? Is it about how much we spend on the poor? How are you going to measure the greatness of a country? So to say that this country is better than that country is a losing debate before you even start, because you haven't decided what makes greatness. What are the criteria that define that? So the idea that a country is exceptional, and more exceptional than every other country, is, again, I think, is a dangerous one. And if we are to be Jeremiahs, if we are to do theological reflection in the time of devastation, we will have to unmask, you know, exceptionalism as being idolatry. Every country is exceptional for some reason or another, but no country is superior, because ultimately no country is permanent. Every country will disappear. And all nations, races, and people in God's world are equal. So that you might find a little controversial. You may find that quite challenging, but I believe, you know, if we are to be Jeremiah, and follow his model of theological reflection, we will at times have to say our country is failing. And even at a time of war, that might involve saying, hey, our country cannot rely on the label of Christianity, and that will somehow make us justified and right in our particular war that we're engaged in. So I've written, I hope at least, a case study for you to have a go at, which you will, I think you will find it very interesting. You might find it very provocative. I kind of hope you do, in a way. So have a go at that, and I look forward to talking and reading your work on the website and in your essay. Thanks very much.